You don't deserve this house anymore. That's what my husband said to me on a Thursday night in October, standing in our kitchen in his work clothes, still smelling like his office downtown. Like nothing unusual had happened that day at all. I had a wooden spoon in my hand. I remember that detail because I gripped it so hard. My knuckles went white. Because for a second, I thought I'd misheard him. Thought maybe the dishwasher running in the background had swallowed half his sentence and turned something normal into something monstrous. What did you just say to me? Marcus didn't repeat it right away. He set his keys down on the counter the way he always did, lined up next to the fruit bowl, like his hands needed something familiar to do, while his mouth said something that wasn't familiar at all. Then he looked at me, and there was nothing in his face I recognized. Not anger. Not guilt. Just a flat, settled calm, like a man reading numbers off a spreadsheet. I said, "You don't deserve this house. I've been thinking about it for a while. I want a divorce." 12 years. We'd been married 12 years, together 14, since I was 26 years old, and waiting tables at a diner off the interstate in Ohio while he was finishing his MBA. 12 years, and he delivered the end of it to me, standing over a pot of marinara sauce, like it was a scheduling conflict. Is this a joke? It's not a joke, Vanessa. I turned off the stove. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost knocked the pot over doing it. Where is this coming from? We had dinner with your mother on Sunday. You helped Caleb with his science project on Monday. I stopped, because I could hear myself doing the thing women do. The thing I'd promised myself I'd never do. Listing evidence like I was building a case. Like logic could undo what he'd already decided in some other room of his mind that I'd never been allowed into. I've been unhappy for a long time, he said. I didn't know how to bring it up. You didn't know how to bring it up. For how long? He didn't answer that. He looked past me, toward the hallway, toward our son's closed bedroom door, and something in his face flickered, just for a second, and I would think about that flicker for weeks afterward, turning it over like a coin, trying to decide what it meant. I think it would be better, he said, if you stayed somewhere else tonight. Things are going to be tense. I don't want Caleb to see us fighting. This is my house, too. It's in my name, Vanessa. You know that. It was my parents' before we got married. He wasn't wrong, technically. The house, a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street in a suburb outside Columbus, had belonged to his father before it belonged to us, passed down when his dad moved into assisted living 3 years ago. We'd put money into it together. New kitchen, new roof, a finished basement I'd designed myself with a reading nook for Caleb. But the deed had his name on it, only his, because at the time it had seemed like a formality, like something that didn't matter between two people who loved each other. I packed a bag with my hands still shaking. I didn't cry, not yet. The crying came later, in the car, in the parking lot of a Hampton Inn off the highway, sitting behind the wheel for 40 minutes before I could make myself walk inside and ask for a room. I told the front desk clerk I'd had a death in the family. It felt true enough. That first night I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the comforter in my clothes and stared at the ceiling and tried to make the last 12 years fit into a story that ended like this. I thought about our wedding, a small outdoor ceremony at his aunt's farm in Licking County. The way he'd cried, reading his vows, actually cried, in front of 40 people, and I'd thought, this is a man who will never let me go. I thought about the late nights over the past 8 or 9 months, the way he'd started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. The way his phone, which used to sit face up on the nightstand, started disappearing into his pocket. The second he walked in the door, I'd noticed all of it. I'd just decided, the way you decide things you're afraid of, that noticing wasn't the same as knowing, and that asking the question out loud might make something true that wasn't true yet. My friend Lacey used to say that to me. If you don't ask, it isn't real. I used to think that was wisdom. That night in the hotel room, I understood it for what it actually was. A coward's prayer. Around 2 a.m, I called my sister Renee in Pittsburgh. She didn't pick up. It was 2 a.m. But I left a voicemail I don't fully remember the contents of. Something garbled about Marcus and the house. And the way he'd lined his keys up next to the fruit bowl like nothing was wrong. She called me back at 6 a.m. before I'd even slept, and the first thing she said was, "I never liked the way he looked at his phone at Thanksgiving." Nobody tells you these things until after. That's the part that still makes me angriest, looking back. Everyone had a small piece of evidence they'd been sitting on, polite and quiet, while I was the only one who didn't know. I didn't go back to the house the next day. I went to work. I managed patient scheduling for an orthopedic practice in Dublin, Ohio. A job I'd had for 6 years, steady, unglamorous. The kind of job that pays the mortgage and not much else. And I sat at my desk answering phones like my whole life hadn't come apart at the seams the night before. Around lunch, I went into the break room and cried into a paper towel for 10 minutes, and then I fixed my mascara in the bathroom mirror and went back to my desk. Because that's what you do. You don't get to fall apart in real time. The falling apart happens in stolen 10-minute windows between phone calls. It was 2 days later, a Saturday, when I realized I'd left something behind that I needed. My late father's pocket watch, the one thing of his I had left, since he passed when I was 31, had been sitting in the top drawer of my nightstand, and in the chaos of packing I hadn't grabbed it. I texted Marcus to ask if he'd be home, and when he didn't respond after 2 hours, I decided I'd just go. It was still my house too, whatever the deed said. I still had a key. I want to tell you I had some premonition driving over there. I didn't. I was thinking about the watch, and about whether Caleb had eaten dinner, and about how I was going to explain any of this to my 8-year-old son when he got home from his father's that weekend. I was thinking about ordinary things, because that's what your mind does to protect you. It keeps you in the small, manageable problems, so you don't have to look at the large, unmanageable one. I pulled into the driveway and noticed an unfamiliar car, a silver Lexus SUV, newer than anything Marcus would normally drive, parked at an angle like whoever owned it hadn't thought twice about whose driveway it was. I remember thinking, distantly, that maybe his sister had come to talk sense into him. His sister drove something like that. It wasn't his sister. I let myself in through the front door, the way I had 10,000 times in 12 years, and I heard music playing. Something soft, jazzy, coming from the kitchen. And a voice. A woman's voice, laughing at something, easy and warm, the kind of laugh that belongs in a house that's comfortable being there. I stood in the entryway for a second too long. Long enough to hear her say, "Babe, where do you keep the wine glasses?" Long enough to hear him answer, from somewhere closer than the kitchen, "Second cabinet, left of the sink." In a voice so casual, so domestic, that it took the air out of my lungs more efficiently than any single sentence he'd said to me 2 nights before. Second cabinet, left of the sink. Where I kept the wine glasses. Where I had kept the wine glasses for 12 years. I walked into the kitchen. She was standing at my counter in a cream-colored sweater, barefoot. Her hair pulled up in a loose knot, pouring red wine into 2 glasses like she'd done it 100 times before. She was younger than me. Not dramatically. Maybe 5 or 6 years. Pretty in a polished, gym-toned way, the kind of pretty that comes with a personal trainer and good lighting. She saw me before Marcus did. Her face went through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked almost like irritation, like I was the one intruding. "Oh," she said. Marcus came around the corner from the dining room holding a phone, and when he saw me, his whole body went rigid. "Vanessa, you should have called. I texted you 2 hours ago. I didn't see it." He set the phone down on the counter slowly, the same way he'd set his keys down 2 nights earlier, like his hands needed a task. This is Tessa. She's a friend." The woman, Tessa, had the decency to look uncomfortable, at least. She didn't say anything. She picked up one of the wine glasses and held it without drinking from it, like a prop she didn't know what to do with anymore. "A friend," I repeated, pouring wine in my kitchen, knowing where my wine glasses are. "It's not what it looks like." I almost laughed. I want you to understand. I actually almost laughed. Standing in my own kitchen, 2 days after my husband of 12 years told me I didn't deserve the house, I'd helped build a life in, looking at a woman in a cream sweater, holding a glass of Cabernet like she belonged there. Because it is always exactly what it looks like. Every single time someone says those words, it is exactly what it looks like. I didn't laugh. I looked around the room instead, the way you do when your brain is trying to catch up to what your eyes already understand. A pair of women's flats by the back door, not mine, size 7, the kind you'd buy at a Nordstrom in a mall I never went to. A leather jacket draped over the back of a dining chair. A toothbrush. I saw it later when I went looking, already sitting in the cup on the bathroom sink upstairs, next to Marcus's, like it had earned a place there. How long? I said. Not a question, a demand. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. Does it matter? It matters. A few months. I knew, the way you know when someone is handing you a number they've already shrunk down to something they can live with. How long, Marcus? He looked at the floor. Since February. It was October. 8 months. 8 months of late nights and calls in the garage, and a phone that disappeared into his pocket. The second he walked through the door. 8 months of me telling myself I was being paranoid. That marriages go through phases. That men get distant when work is stressful. That I was the problem for noticing too much, instead of him being the problem for giving me so much to notice. Tessa set her wine glass down. I should go, she said quietly, to no one in particular, and gathered her jacket and her shoes and let herself out the back door without looking at me. The door clicked shut behind her, and then it was just the two of us. 12 years of marriage standing in a kitchen that smelled like someone else's wine. I was going to tell you, Marcus said. I didn't want it to be like this. You threw me out of my own house 2 nights ago and didn't think this conversation was overdue? I didn't think you'd come back. That was the part that broke something loose in me. Not the affair itself, though God knows that was enough. But the fact that his greatest concern, even now standing in the wreckage of what he'd done, was that I'd shown up before he was ready for me to know. Not guilt. Not shame. Logistics. I had interrupted his schedule. I walked past him into the dining room, where I'd noticed a stack of folders on the table when I came in. Half hidden under a junk mail pile, the kind of thing you wouldn't look twice at unless something told you to. Something told me to. I picked up the top folder and opened it. Inside were printouts, bank statements, a property appraisal for the house, dated 3 months earlier, a spreadsheet, his handwriting in the margins, listing our joint accounts and an uneven division of the balances, uneven in his favor. A draft separation agreement from a law firm downtown, already typed up, already formatted with both our names, missing only signatures. What is this? My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. He didn't answer right away, and that hesitation told me everything the document already had. This wasn't a man who'd fallen in love unexpectedly and panicked. This was a man who had been planning an exit for months. Quietly, methodically, while I sat across from him at dinner, asking if he was okay, while I gave him the benefit of every doubt I had left in me. You had a law firm draft, a separation agreement, before you even told me you wanted a divorce. I wanted to be prepared. You wanted to be prepared to leave me with as little as possible, you mean? I flipped through the pages. The retirement account, the one we'd both contributed to for over a decade, the one where my contributions over the past 3 years had actually outpaced his because of a promotion I'd gotten. He'd structured the proposed split so that I'd walk away with a fraction of what was legally mine. The house solely his. Fine. But the renovations, the basement I'd designed and partially paid for out of a small inheritance from my grandmother, none of that was accounted for anywhere. I didn't say anything else. I took out my phone and started photographing every page. What are you doing? His voice had an edge of panic in it now, the first real emotion he'd shown me since I'd walked through the door. Protecting myself. You don't need to do that. We can figure this out like adults. You figured it out like an adult 8 months ago, Marcus. Without me. I kept photographing. My hands had stopped shaking. Somewhere in the last 5 minutes, the shaking had turned into something else, something colder, steadier. Something I didn't fully recognize in myself but was grateful for. Because it was the only thing keeping me upright. I found my father's watch upstairs, in the nightstand drawer exactly where I'd left it. And I took it, and I took my jewelry box too, and a framed photo of my mother that had been sitting on the dresser, and I left without saying another word to him. He didn't try to stop me. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched me carry boxes out to my car. And the last thing he said to me, as I was pulling the front door shut behind me, was, "I never meant for you to find out like this." As if there were a version of finding out that wouldn't have felt like having the floor pulled out from under me. As if the method mattered more than the years he'd spent constructing a life he intended to walk away from, while I was still busy building it. I drove straight to my sister's apartment that night, 2 hours to Pittsburgh, because I couldn't stand the thought of another night alone in a hotel room with nothing but my own thoughts for company. Renee opened the door in her pajamas, took one look at my face, and didn't ask a single question. She just pulled me inside and made tea and sat with me on her couch until 3 in the morning while I told her everything. The folder, the spreadsheet, the law firm, the 8 months, the woman in the cream sweater who knew where the wine glasses were. "You're going to need a lawyer," Renee said. "A good one. Not whoever you'd normally call for a will." I don't even know where to start. I do. There's a woman my coworker used for her divorce. Brutal, apparently.
In a good way.
The next morning, Renee called and got me a consultation for that Thursday with an attorney named Patricia Ferris, who had a downtown office with a view of the Allegheny River and a reputation, Renee told me, for eating men like Marcus for breakfast. I didn't fully believe that kind of thing existed until I sat across from her desk 3 days later and watched her flip through the photos I'd taken of Marcus's folder with an expression I can only describe as quiet, professional delight. He had a draft separation agreement prepared by a lawyer before he told you he wanted a divorce, she said, more to herself than to me, tapping her pen against the desk. And you have photographic proof of an asset division that excludes your documented contributions to the property and shortchanges your portion of a joint retirement account he had no unilateral right to restructure. She looked up at me. "Mrs. Ashworth, this is going to be a very good case for us." For the first time in 5 days, I felt something other than grief. Over the following weeks, the story I'd been telling myself, that this was some sudden unexplainable collapse, fell away entirely, replaced by a much uglier and much more coherent one. Tessa, it turned out, wasn't some recent infatuation. She worked at a marketing firm that Marcus's company contracted with, and according to my friend Diane, who still had a friend inside his office, the two of them had been obviously something since at least the previous winter. Long lunches, after-work drinks that turned into after-work everything. A Vegas conference trip in March that Marcus had told me was just him and 2 coworkers from finance. I went back through old calendar entries on our shared family app, the one we used to coordinate Caleb's pickups and drop-offs, and found a pattern. I'd been too busy, too trusting, too exhausted from working full-time and managing our son's schedule and the house to notice in real time. Late nights that didn't correspond to any project deadlines I could find evidence of. A Geeze's weekend in April that, according to Diane's source, had included exactly one guy. I told Caleb's pediatrician's office I needed a personal day and spent it instead. Going through 12 years of financial records with Patricia's paralegal. Building a case that wasn't really about anger anymore. It had moved past that into something more like architecture. I wasn't trying to destroy Marcus. I was trying to make sure he couldn't finish the job of erasing me from a life I'd spent 12 years helping to build. Caleb was the hardest part. He was 8, old enough to know something was wrong, too young to be told. Most of why. I told him his dad and I were going to live in different houses for a while, that it wasn't his fault, that we both loved him exactly the same as we always had. He cried for 3 nights in a row, and on the 4th night he asked me, in that direct way kids have of asking the question adults are too afraid to ask each other, "Is Dad's friend going to be my new mom?" I didn't have an answer that didn't taste like glass in my mouth. I told him no one was anyone's mom but me, and that whatever happened with his dad's life, that part wasn't changing. And he seemed to accept that the way kids accept things adults can't fully explain by simply deciding to trust you because the alternative is too frightening. I found a 2-bedroom rental in Dublin, close enough to Caleb's school that his routine wouldn't have to change, and I spent a weekend with Renee and our mother. Painting the second bedroom a soft blue Caleb picked out himself. Putting together furniture from a Wayfair order with an Allen wrench and a YouTube tutorial, and more curse words than I'd like to admit to in front of my mother. It was the first thing that had felt entirely mine in weeks. A room I chose. A wall color nobody vetoed. The divorce proceedings took 5 months, longer than I expected, and shorter than Patricia warned me they might. Marcus's attorney tried in the beginning to argue that the house and its associated equity were entirely separate property, untouched by our marriage, but Patricia produced 11 years of renovation receipts, contractor invoices with both our names on the contracts, and a notarized letter from my late grandmother's estate, documenting the $15,000 I'd put toward the basement remodel. The court didn't award me the house. It had never been jointly titled, and Ohio law is what it is. But it did award me a settlement reflecting my financial contribution to its improvements, plus an equitable division of the retirement accounts that left me with considerably more than the spreadsheet in Marcus's folder had ever intended for me to have. The day the settlement was finalized, I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot for a long time before I drove anywhere. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Mostly, I just felt tired. The particular exhaustion that comes after carrying something heavy for a long time and finally being allowed to set it down. Marcus and Tessa moved in together that spring into a townhouse 20 minutes from the house kept, the house I used to call home. I heard about it the way you hear about most things after a divorce. Secondhand, filtered through someone who thought you'd want to know, or maybe just couldn't resist telling you. I felt the old sting for about an hour, and then, strangely, I didn't feel much of anything at all. It had stopped being my business sometime around the moment I drove away from that house with my father's watch in my jacket pocket. What I felt instead, over the following year, was something I hadn't expected and didn't entirely trust at first, because I'd never had the chance to feel it as an adult. Room to rebuild a life according to my own preferences instead of a negotiated compromise. I started taking a Tuesday night pottery class at the Community Arts Center, something I'd wanted to do for a decade and never made time for, because there was always dinner to cook, always a schedule to manage. That wasn't mine alone. I got better at my job, asked for, and received a raise the following January. The first time in years I'd advocated for myself, instead of quietly waiting to be noticed. I went to therapy every other week with a woman named Dr. Okafor, who helped me understand that the 8 months I'd spent ignoring warning signs weren't a personal failure, but a very human, very common response to fear, that noticing and not wanting to know are two different muscles. And mine had simply atrophied from disuse over 12 years of choosing peace over confrontation. Caleb adjusted better than I'd feared he would. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for, provided the adults around them do the hard, unglamorous work of staying steady. He split his time between 2 houses, 2 bedrooms, 2 sets of routines, and somewhere in the second year, he stopped flinching every time he heard his parents on the phone with each other, because the calls had become boring. Logistics about school pickup, nothing more. No raised voices, no folders full of secrets. I think about that night in the kitchen sometimes, the silver Lexus in the driveway, the woman pouring wine into glasses. She had no right to know the location of. I used to think about it with rage. Now, I mostly think about it with something closer to gratitude, which surprised me the first time I noticed the shift. Marcus didn't destroy my life that night. He revealed something I'd been too afraid to look at directly, that I had been quietly disappearing inside a marriage for longer than 8 months, shrinking myself into the spaces he left available, mistaking accommodation for love. I'm 39 now. I own my rental outright as of last spring, the settlement money put to better use than I ever imagined it would be. When Patricia first slid those documents across her desk. Caleb is 10, taller than I am, most days it feels like, still asking direct questions I don't always have perfect answers for. I started seeing someone last fall, a contractor named Theo who I met, of all places, at the pottery studio. Fixing a kiln that had been broken for months. Slow, careful, unhurried, in a way that still feels foreign to me, after 12 years with a man who made decisions about my life, in rooms I wasn't invited into. Marcus thought he was taking everything from me. The night he lined his keys up next to the fruit bowl and told me I didn't deserve a house his family had owned before I ever walked into it. He was wrong. He took a house. He took 12 years I can't get back, and some trust I'm still slowly rebuilding, brick by brick, with people who've earned it. But I walked out of that kitchen with my father's watch in my pocket and a folder of evidence on my phone, and what I built afterward. A home that's actually mine, a son who knows what steady love looks like, even when it comes from one direction instead of two. A version of myself I like considerably more than the one who used to apologize for noticing things. None of that was his to take. He lost someone who spent 12 years building a life around him without asking for much in return. I lost someone who'd already stopped being who I thought he was, probably long before that night in the kitchen. Possibly long before I had the courage to admit it to myself. In the end, only one of us figured out how to recover from that. It wasn't him.